It was a calm morning in the small neighborhood market, the kind of place people visited not just to shop, but because it felt familiar. The aisles were narrow, the music played softly from speakers near the ceiling, and the smell of fresh bread drifted from the little bakery corner. Most customers came in and out quickly, picking up only what they needed. But that morning moved a bit slower for one person. An elderly woman walked into the store with steady but gentle steps. Her gray hair was tied in a loose bun, and she carried a small cloth bag that looked like she had owned it for years. She wasn't in a hurry. She had a quiet way of moving, as if she didn't want to disturb anything or anyone around her. She looked at the shelves carefully, picking up only the basics: a carton of milk, a loaf of bread, a small pack of tea, and a little jar of honey. These weren't luxury items. They were simple things, the kind she probably bought every week. Every time she picked something, she checked the price tag twice, then nodded to herself before placing it into her basket. After finishing her shopping, she walked toward the checkout counter. There was only one counter open at that moment, and a young store employee stood behind it. He looked tired and in no mood for extra effort. His arms were crossed, and he tapped his foot as if time couldn't move fast enough. The elderly woman placed her items on the counter and gave the employee a small, warm smile. She searched through her cloth bag for her wallet, then opened it slowly. Inside were several small coins and a few folded notes that looked like they had been used many times. She chose to pay with coins? Maybe because she wanted to save the notes for something more important. She began counting her coins one by one, placing them carefully on the counter. Her hands moved a bit shakily, not because she was unsure, but because age had made her movements softer and slower. She kept apologizing in a humble voice whenever she dropped a coin or miscounted. "I'm sorry." "Just give me a moment," she said softly, almost whispering, as if she didn't want to trouble anyone around her. Behind her, a few people started forming a small line. No one was angry, but the young employee made it seem like the world was ending. He sighed loudly and looked away, rolling his eyes just enough so the woman didn't see, but everyone else did. His impatience filled the space like a heavy cloud. The woman didn't notice his expression. She was too focused on making sure her count was right. She wanted to pay the exact amount so she wouldn't need change. Maybe she didn't want to depend on anyone. Maybe she didn't want to feel like a burden. Whatever the reason, she was doing her best. She placed a few more coins on the counter, then paused to recount them. The employee looked at the screen, checking her total, then glanced at the small pile of coins as if it were a mountain of work waiting for him. "Ma'am, can you hurry a little?" he said in an annoyed voice, not shouting but not gentle either. "People are waiting." His tone was sharp enough that a couple of customers raised their eyebrows. They didn't say anything, but they knew the woman didn't deserve to be spoken to like that. The elderly woman looked up with startled eyes. She didn't get angry. She didn't defend herself. Instead, she nodded quickly, almost apologetically, as if she had done something terribly wrong. Her fingers moved even more shakily now, trying desperately to gather the last few coins. "I'm very sorry," she whispered again. Her voice smaller this time, she bent slightly, looking at the coins in her hand, trying to separate them. It was clear she was nervous. Her breaths became shorter, and she started making little mistakes, counting coins twice or skipping one by accident. Every small error added more pressure, and each time she corrected herself, she whispered, "Sorry." "Sorry." The employee sighed again, louder this time. He tapped the counter with his pen, making a sharp clicking sound that felt like a signal of frustration. It wasn't necessary, but he did it anyway, letting everyone know how inconvenient he found the moment. A few customers at the back of the line exchanged glances. Some looked uncomfortable, others looked impatient, but mostly they felt bad for the elderly woman. Still, no one spoke up. People rarely do in such situations. Even when they know the right thing, the woman finally counted what she believed was the right amount. She pushed the coins forward, her eyes hopeful but uncertain. "Is this enough?" she asked softly, her voice trembling like she feared another unpleasant response. The employee quickly glanced at the coins, then at the screen, and sighed yet again. "No, it's short," he said bluntly. "You still need a little more." Can you please check again? The words weren't technically harsh, but the way he delivered them made them feel heavy. The elderly woman's shoulders dropped slightly. She reached into her cloth bag again, searching for more coins. Her hands fumbled and a coin slipped from her fingers, rolling across the counter and falling to the floor with a tiny clink. The employee didn't move to help. He simply stared, waiting. The woman bent down slowly, carefully, holding onto the counter for balance. She picked up the coin with difficulty and rose again, her breath unsteady from the effort. "I'll find the rest." "Just a second," she murmured, trying not to look embarrassed. Those behind her could see her struggle clearly. She wasn't wasting time out of carelessness. She was doing her best, what no one realized. Not the employee, not the customers, not even the elderly woman, was that a man had quietly stepped into the line behind her just moments earlier. He wasn't dressed in a flashy way. He wasn't trying to get attention. He simply waited, holding a small bottle of water in his hand. Watching the scene unfold with calm eyes, he didn't look irritated, even though the line had slowed down. He didn't sigh or check his phone impatiently. Instead, he observed the elderly woman with gentle concern, noticing every little detail, the shake in her fingers, the worry in her eyes, the way she kept apologizing for something that wasn't her fault. Some customers recognized him and whispered softly, but he paid no attention to them. His focus remained on the woman at the counter. The store felt unusually quiet for a moment, as if time had paused. The only sound was the faint clinking of coins as the woman tried again to gather the right amount. Behind her, the man continued to wait patiently, thinking carefully about whether he should step in or give her space. He didn't want to make her feel self-conscious, but he also didn't want her to feel alone. The employee, however, had no such sensitivity. He tapped the counter again, his frustration growing. "Ma'am, seriously. Can you please just—" But before he finished his sentence, the elderly woman finally set down another small pile of coins. "I think this should be enough," she said, trying to sound confident, though her voice still trembled. And just like that, Part 1 ends with the air around them tightening, a quiet tension waiting for someone to break it. Someone already standing right behind her, unnoticed, calm and ready. The elderly woman pushed the last few coins forward, her hands shaking slightly, hoping they would be enough. She looked up at the young store employee with a small, polite smile, trying to show she had done her best. Her eyes, though a little tired, were warm and kind. She didn't want to argue. She didn't want trouble. She just wanted to pay for her groceries and leave quietly, like any respectful customer would. But the young employee wasn't impressed. He stared at the coins on the counter, tapping them lightly with his pen. His expression was one of irritation, and his lips were pressed into a tight line. The way he looked at her made it clear that he thought she was wasting his time. He leaned slightly forward, his arms resting on the counter, and spoke in a tone that was meant to sound sharp but not loud. "Seriously? Are you counting these coins one by one?" "People are waiting," he said. The words weren't particularly harsh, but the way he said them carried impatience, judgment, and a hint of condescension. He wasn't being rude in an accidental way, it was deliberate. He wanted to show that he had no patience for someone who was taking longer than he thought. "They should—" The elderly woman flinched slightly. She didn't respond right away. Her hands paused above the coins, trembling ever so slightly as she tried to maintain her composure. She lowered her gaze for a moment, looking down at her small, worn hands. These hands had held many things in life, not just coins, but letters, photographs, groceries for family, and maybe even the hands of someone she loved dearly. Yet here, in this small store, it felt like they were being judged for something as simple as counting coins. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, almost in a whisper. "I just want to make sure I have the right amount." Her voice was soft, not defensive. She wasn't looking to start an argument or cause a scene. She only wanted to finish the simple act of paying for her groceries without feeling embarrassed. But her words did little to change the young employee's mood. He sighed loudly, the kind of sigh that draws attention and signals frustration. He glanced at the small line of people waiting behind her and muttered under his breath, "People these days." The woman's eyes widened slightly at the comment. She wasn't sure if it was meant for her or just a general remark, but it still stung. Even if she tried not to take it personally, the tone made her feel small, like she didn't belong there. She lowered her gaze to the coins again, counting them once more, careful to avoid mistakes. As she worked, a few customers waiting in line behind her exchanged glances. Some looked uncomfortable, shifting from foot to foot, unsure whether to say something. Others looked silently supportive, nodding slightly to themselves, recognizing the unfairness of the situation. But no one spoke. People rarely do when confronted with awkward moments in public. Even when they know the right thing to do, what the woman didn't know was that someone in the line behind her wasn't like the others. A man stood quietly, observing the situation with calm and gentle attention. He was tall, dressed simply, and moved without drawing attention to himself. He had been waiting patiently, holding a small bottle of water. Watching the woman as she struggled with the coins, he didn't frown or sigh impatiently like the others. He didn't check his phone or tap his foot. Instead, he watched her with understanding eyes, noticing the little tremble in her hands, the careful way she placed the coins, and the polite tone she used even under pressure. He didn't rush her. He didn't make a scene. He simply observed, ready to act if needed, quietly holding space for someone who needed it. Meanwhile, the young employee's frustration continued to build. He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the counter, and spoke again, a little louder this time. "Ma'am, seriously, can you just hurry up? I can't keep waiting forever." The words hit the elderly woman harder than she expected. She felt her cheeks grow warm. She wasn't used to being spoken to in such a tone. Her hands paused above the coins, and she bit her lip nervously. She was trying to focus, trying to get the right amount, but the pressure made it even harder. She glanced up briefly at the young employee, searching for a hint of patience or understanding. There was none. All she saw was annoyance and impatience, a complete lack of empathy. She looked down again at her coins, and her fingers fumbled slightly, causing a few coins to fall onto the counter with a soft clink. The young employee didn't help. He didn't move to assist her or show a gesture of kindness. He simply waited, tapping his pen against the counter again, making the small sound feel like a drum of criticism. The woman bent down slowly to pick up the coins, holding the counter with one hand for support. Her back bent slightly, her movements careful and deliberate. The customers in line began shifting, some feeling uncomfortable, others trying not to stare too obviously. There was a quiet tension in the store now, the kind that makes everyone aware of a conflict even when no one is shouting. The elderly woman placed the coins back on the counter, her breath steadying as she tried to calm herself. I think this should be enough," she said softly, pushing the coins toward the employee once more. She looked up briefly, hoping to catch a glimpse of a kind word or a nod of approval. The young employee leaned over, looking at the coins. He tapped a few of them with his pen again, making the clinking sound echo slightly in the quiet store. He frowned, clearly unhappy. Then he muttered, "Yeah, it's fine. I guess." His tone lacked any warmth or acknowledgement of her effort. The woman exhaled quietly, relief washing over her. She had done her best, and it was accepted even if grudgingly. She reached into her cloth bag to pull out a few items she had set aside for packing. Her hands were still a little shaky, but she moved carefully, determined to finish without any further mistakes. As she bagged her groceries, she noticed the man behind her had moved slightly closer. Not in a way that was intrusive, but just enough to be supportive if needed. She hadn't paid much attention to him before, but now she noticed a calm presence. His posture was relaxed, his expression neutral, yet somehow kind. She didn't know who he was. He didn't say a word. He simply observed and waited, ready to step in if necessary. There was a quiet strength about him, a sense that he wouldn't allow anyone to be treated unfairly while he was there. The young employee, meanwhile, seemed to realize that something was off. He glanced up and caught sight of a few customers whispering and staring in the direction of the man behind the woman. He didn't understand why people were looking, but he felt a small twinge of unease. He shifted uncomfortably, as if sensing that he might have overstepped without realizing it. The elderly woman, oblivious to the attention behind her, finished placing the groceries in her bag. She smiled politely at the employee, her face calm but slightly nervous. She didn't want to make a scene, and she didn't want anyone to feel uncomfortable. She simply wanted to leave with her groceries and return home. The man behind her continued to watch quietly. He didn't intervene yet. He didn't need to. The situation had already shown the impatience of the young employee and the patience of the elderly woman. But he knew that sometimes a small act of kindness could make a difference. He didn't want to embarrass anyone. He didn't want to draw attention unnecessarily. He only wanted to ensure that respect and dignity were preserved. As the woman finished, she gathered her bags and prepared to step away from the counter. The employee looked at her briefly, his expression still irritated but slightly softened. Perhaps he realized that she had done her best under pressure and that his impatience had been unkind. But it was a small, fleeting thought, and it didn't translate into words. The man behind her stepped forward slowly, quietly, without drawing attention. He moved just enough to be ready, to offer help if needed, but without making the moment about himself. His presence alone brought a subtle sense of reassurance, the kind that can be felt even when no one speaks. The elderly woman looked at him briefly as she turned to leave the counter, but she didn't recognize him. She didn't know his name, and she didn't know what he might do next. She simply felt a quiet sense of support. Even if she didn't fully understand it, the young employee, still behind the counter, tapped the pen one last time, then sighed. He didn't say anything further. He didn't apologize, but the tension in his shoulders suggested he knew something had shifted. He had treated someone unfairly, and even if he didn't admit it aloud, the awareness was there. The quiet, small moments in life often go unnoticed, but sometimes they have a way of leaving a mark. The elderly woman walked toward the door with her groceries. She didn't know it yet, but her simple act of patience and grace had already caught the attention of someone who would not forget it. Someone who valued kindness above all else. And as the door opened, letting the soft morning light spill into the store, the calm presence of the man behind her lingered, ready to step forward when the moment truly needed. The elderly woman had finally gathered her groceries and placed the coins on the counter. She had tried her best to remain calm, polite, and patient throughout the whole experience. But even with her best effort, the tension in the small store didn't disappear entirely. The young employee still looked impatient, tapping his pen lightly against the counter, his eyes scanning the coins as if he expected them to multiply before his very eyes. The woman's hands trembled slightly, not from weakness but from nerves and the stress of being treated unfairly in public. She had hoped for a simple transaction, something ordinary that wouldn't make her feel embarrassed. But life sometimes surprises you in the quietest of ways, and today would be no different. Behind her, the man who had been observing the scene quietly shifted his weight. He didn't move forward aggressively. He didn't want to draw attention or create a scene. He simply stood there, calm and composed, taking in the small details of what was happening. He noticed the subtle discomfort in the other customers, the way a few people were glancing at the counter and whispering to one another, unsure whether they should intervene or just wait. He also noticed the young employee's growing frustration. It wasn't just impatience anymore. There was irritation mixed with a sense of superiority, the kind that comes when someone believes they are above another person for no real reason. The man behind the woman recognized this instantly. He understood how easy it can be to judge, to lose patience, or to forget that every person deserves respect. The elderly woman finally looked up from her coins again. She smiled politely at the employee, her voice soft, trying to ease the tension. "I think this should cover it," she said, her words carrying quiet dignity. She didn't complain. She didn't demand better treatment. She simply asked to be treated fairly, but the employee's eyes narrowed slightly. "Yeah, I guess," he muttered. There was no warmth in his tone. It wasn't a compliment or acknowledgement of her effort. It was barely enough to pass as polite speech. The woman felt a small pang of disappointment, but she hid it behind a polite nod. She was used to handling small frustrations with patience and grace. The man behind her, however, was not used to staying silent in the face of unfairness. He had watched this kind of thing many times, but today felt different. He could sense the woman's quiet struggle and the subtle embarrassment she was enduring. He could see how much effort she was putting into something as simple as paying for her groceries, and he felt a strong urge to step in. But he also understood the importance of timing and approach. He waited patiently, making sure he didn't interrupt her or make her feel uncomfortable. He didn't want her to feel like she needed his help, but he also didn't want her to feel alone. Sometimes he knew simply standing nearby, showing quiet support, could be more powerful than words. The store seemed unusually quiet for a few moments. Even the soft music in the background felt like it had dimmed, as if the entire space was holding its breath. The customers in line shifted uncomfortably, unsure what to do. They could sense the tension, the quiet struggle between patience and impatience, dignity and rudeness. And in the middle of it all stood a woman simply trying to pay for her groceries without being humiliated. Finally, the man decided it was time to act. He stepped forward just enough to be noticed, his movements calm and unhurried. There was no rush in his approach. There was no aggression or confrontation in his manner. He simply moved forward with a quiet confidence that made the air in the store feel a little lighter. Even before he spoke, the elderly woman glanced back briefly as he approached. She didn't recognize him and she didn't know what to expect. He wasn't drawing attention to himself, but there was a sense of reassurance in the way he carried himself, a quiet presence that seemed to say, "Everything will be okay." He looked at the coins on the counter and then back at the woman. "I can cover this for you," he said in a calm, gentle voice. There was no judgment in his tone. There was no showiness, no need to prove anything. Just kindness. The woman blinked in surprise. She wasn't expecting anyone to intervene. Her eyes widened slightly, and her lips parted as she tried to find the words to express her gratitude. "Oh, thank you," she whispered. Her voice was filled with genuine appreciation, mixed with disbelief. The young employee froze. For a moment, he didn't know what to do. He looked at the coins on the counter, then at the man standing quietly behind the woman. Something in his expression shifted, surprise, confusion, maybe even a hint of fear. He recognized the man, not by the way he looked, but by the calm, composed energy he carried. He could feel that this was someone he should not have disrespected, someone whose presence alone commanded respect. The man didn't say anything more. He simply waited, allowing the elderly woman to process what had happened. She smiled again, this time more openly, and gave a small nod. Her eyes met his for a brief moment, and in that glance there was an unspoken connection, an acknowledgement of care, respect, and humanity. The other customers in the store began whispering among themselves. Some recognized the man, though a few were still unsure. They noticed the gentle way he had intervened, the respect he showed, and the quiet dignity with which he handled the situation. It was clear that he wasn't there for attention or praise. He was there because he believed it was the right thing to do. The young employee finally recovered from his surprise. He looked down at the coins, then back at the man, and muttered a quiet apology. I'm sorry," he said almost under his breath. The apology wasn't loud or dramatic, but it carried sincerity. For the first time, he seemed to realize the impact of his impatience and rudeness. The elderly woman shook her head gently, still smiling. "It's all right," she said softly. She didn't want to make him feel worse than he already did. She didn't want conflict. She simply wanted fairness and kindness, and she had received it in the most unexpected way. The man handed a small amount of money to cover the remaining coins. He didn't make a show of it. He didn't brag. He simply placed the bills on the counter and nodded gently. "There you go," he said. "Everything's fine now." The woman's hands trembled slightly as she accepted the money. She carefully placed it back into her bag, her heart full of gratitude. She smiled at the man again, this time with a warmth that was impossible to miss. "Thank you so much," she said, her voice stronger now. "You didn't have to do that." He smiled faintly, a quiet, reassuring smile. "It's no trouble at all," he said. "Everyone deserves respect." The atmosphere in the store shifted. The tension that had been thick moments ago seemed to dissipate. The other customers whispered to one another, nodding, their faces filled with surprise and admiration. They had just witnessed a moment of kindness that wasn't loud or dramatic, but powerful in its simplicity. The young employee, now fully aware of what had happened, seemed humbled. He avoided looking at the woman directly, focusing instead on the counter. There was a small change in him, a shift from irritation to understanding, a recognition that patience and empathy matter more than impatience and judgment. The elderly woman finally gathered her bags and turned to leave the counter. The man behind her gave a small nod and she nodded back, a silent acknowledgement of the connection they had shared in those few minutes. She didn't need to know his name or why he had chosen to help. The gesture itself was enough to restore her sense of dignity and calmed as she walked toward the door. She felt lighter, almost as if a burden had been lifted from her shoulders. The sun outside shone softly through the store windows, and the morning air felt fresher somehow. She carried her groceries carefully, her hands still shaking slightly, but her heart felt full. The man stayed behind for a moment, making sure everything was in order. He didn't linger unnecessarily. He didn't want attention or praise. He simply wanted to ensure that the elderly woman had been treated with the respect she deserved. The customers in the store quietly continued with their shopping, but something had changed. They had seen a small act of kindness, simple and genuine, that reminded them of the importance of patience and humanity. It was a lesson that didn't require shouting or dramatics. It was just there, quiet and powerful, lingering in the air. The young employee, now fully aware of the moment, began to clean up the counter, his movements slower and more careful. He seemed reflective, as if considering how he could act differently in the future. He realized that small moments like these matter, moments when respect, patience, and kindness can make all the difference. And as the elderly woman stepped outside, the man watched her go, satisfied that he had helped without making anyone feel embarrassed or exposed. He didn't need recognition. He didn't need applause. He had simply done what he believed was right. Sometimes he knew that was enough. The elderly woman had finally completed her small but important task. Her groceries were bagged, the coins counted, and the last bit of payment quietly covered by the man who had stepped in to help. Yet the moment wasn't over. There was a subtle shift in the air, a sense that something had changed. The tension that had filled the store moments ago had not completely vanished. It lingered in the young employee's posture, in the cautious glances of the other customers, and in the soft hum of the music overhead. The young employee, still behind the counter, looked at the man who had quietly intervened. Something about him made the employee pause and reconsider. He had seen people in the store before, customers who came and went without much thought. But this man was different. There was a calm authority in his presence, a quiet confidence that didn't demand attention yet drew it naturally. The employee couldn't explain why, but he felt an instant weight in the room, a sense that he needed to reassess his behavior. The elderly woman stood near the counter, still holding her small cloth bag and the grocery bags carefully in her hands. She felt a mixture of relief and gratitude. Relief that the interaction had finally ended without further embarrassment, and gratitude for the unexpected kindness of the man behind her. She looked up at him briefly, just enough to acknowledge him. There was no need for words. A simple nod, a glance, a soft smile, that was enough to communicate her thanks. The man nodded back, returning the gesture with the same quiet warmth. There was no need for a big show, no need for dramatic words. Sometimes, he knew, the smallest gestures speak the loudest. The elderly woman felt reassured. She didn't know who he was, but his kindness had restored something that had been shaken in a few short minutes. Her sense of dignity and calm. The young employee, meanwhile, was still trying to process what had happened. His hands hovered over the register, unsure what to do next. For the first time in his day, he felt truly uncomfortable with his own behavior. The impatience, the frustration, the unnecessary remarks, they all replayed in his mind like a mirror, showing him a version of himself he didn't like. He realized he had been unkind, and more than that, he had been unfair. The quiet, simple act of another person's kindness had highlighted his mistake in a way that words never could. The man who had intervened didn't make the employee feel small or embarrassed. He didn't point out mistakes or criticize. He simply acted with respect, dignity, and calmness. That alone was enough to make the employee feel the weight of his behavior. Slowly, almost reluctantly, the employee muttered, I'm sorry." The words were quiet, almost hesitant, but they were genuine. It was the first sign of humility he had shown all morning. The elderly woman shook her head gently. "It's all right," she said softly, her voice filled with kindness. She didn't want to humiliate him. She didn't want him to feel worse than he already did. She simply wanted the interaction to end with understanding rather than tension. Her words were simple, but they carried an enormous weight of compassion. The man who had helped remained calm, watching quietly, ensuring that the situation had been diffused. He didn't need to speak loudly or make a scene. The act itself, quiet, respectful, and genuine, had already set the tone. The store seemed calmer now. The previous tension replaced by a sense of relief and appreciation. The customers in the store had been watching silently, unsure how to react at first. They had witnessed the impatience and frustration of the young employee, the nervousness and vulnerability of the elderly woman, and finally, the quiet intervention that had restored balance. Whispers began to ripple through the small group of shoppers, expressions of admiration and surprise appearing on their faces. Many of them recognized that they had just seen something meaningful. A small but important demonstration of empathy and respect. The young employee, now fully aware of the impact of his behavior, began to act differently. He straightened his posture, avoided rolling his eyes or tapping his pen, and spoke with a softer tone. He didn't make excuses or try to justify himself. He simply acknowledged the mistake and began to treat the interaction with the respect it deserved. It was a subtle change, but it was noticeable. The elderly woman started to step away from the counter, carefully holding her grocery bags. She moved slowly, not because she was weak, but because she wanted to make sure everything was stable and secure. The man who had helped her stayed a few steps behind, giving her space, but ensuring she felt supported. There was no rush, no urgency. Just calm, steady reassurance. As she walked toward the door, she glanced back briefly. Her eyes met the man's once more, and in that single glance there was a deep sense of connection and gratitude. She didn't need to know his name or why he had chosen to help. She didn't need a story or an explanation. The moment itself was enough. The small act of kindness had restored her dignity, and that was all that mattered. The man watched her leave, satisfied that she was safe and treated with respect. He didn't linger unnecessarily. He didn't need recognition or praise. He had done what he believed was right, and that was enough. There was a quiet strength in that understanding. A recognition that sometimes the simplest actions, a calm word, a gentle gesture, a small act of generosity, can make the biggest difference. The young employee returned to his duties, moving with a slower, more deliberate pace. There was no dramatic change, no grand announcement of personal growth, but there was a noticeable shift. He seemed more mindful, more aware of the people around him, and more careful with his words. The tension that had filled the store earlier had been replaced by a quiet sense of reflection. The customers continued shopping, but the atmosphere had changed. There was a subtle warmth in the air, a sense of shared experience. They had witnessed a small act of human kindness, one that didn't require drama or recognition, but that left a lasting impression. The story of patience, dignity, and quiet intervention had unfolded in a few short moments. Yet its impact was clear. The elderly woman had left the store, walking slowly but confidently, her groceries in hand. The man who had helped her returned to a quiet corner of the store, observing briefly to ensure nothing else was out of order. He didn't seek attention. He didn't need anyone to notice. His actions spoke for themselves. Sometimes he knew that was all that mattered. The young employee continued to process the events in his mind. He realized that his impatience and frustration had caused unnecessary discomfort. He understood, perhaps for the first time, that everyone deserves respect and patience, no matter how small the interaction may seem. The quiet dignity of the elderly woman, combined with the calm and gentle intervention of the man, had left a lasting lesson. In those few minutes, the entire store had been reminded of something important. Human kindness doesn't have to be loud or dramatic. It can be quiet, subtle, and simple. It can come from someone standing behind you, noticing your struggle, and choosing to help without expecting anything in return. And the impact of that kindness can ripple out, touching not just the person being helped, but everyone who witnesses it. The elderly woman's day continued, but with a lighter heart. She carried her groceries carefully, but her mind was at ease. The embarrassment and stress she had felt moments earlier had been replaced by a quiet sense of gratitude and comfort. She had been seen, treated with respect, and supported when she needed it most. The man who had intervened didn't linger. He left the store quietly, blending into the world as if nothing had happened, but the small act of kindness he had offered remained. It remained in the heart of the elderly woman, in the subtle change of the young employee, and in the quiet awareness of the other customers who had witnessed it. Sometimes, life presents us with small moments of challenge. Sometimes people face impatience, judgment, or misunderstanding. But in those moments, acts of empathy and respect have the power to restore balance, calm, and dignity. They remind us of what matters most: compassion, patience, and the quiet courage to do what is right. The young employee returned to his work, thoughtful and reflective. He didn't try to show off his change or announce a newfound wisdom. He simply worked with more care, spoke with a softer tone, and noticed the people around him more carefully. Small, meaningful shifts like this are often invisible to the world, but they are powerful nonetheless. The elderly woman, walking home with her groceries, felt lighter and more at peace. The encounter had reminded her that kindness still existed in the world. That even when people are impatient or unkind, there are those who notice, who intervene gently, and who act with empathy without expecting anything in return. And sometimes, the most powerful lessons come not from words or lectures, but from quiet, human moments when dignity is preserved, when patience is shown, and when kindness is offered without hesitation. The day, ordinary in many ways, had become extraordinary because of this. The man who had helped her moved on with his day quietly, blending back into the world as if he had not done anything at all. But the impact of his actions remained. It lingered in the elderly woman's heart, in the young employee's newfound awareness, and in the minds of the people who had witnessed a simple, profound lesson in human kindness. In a small store on an ordinary morning, a quiet act of compassion had changed everything. And sometimes that is eno. The elderly woman had left the small store with her groceries, walking slowly but steadily down the quiet street. Her steps were careful, but there was a new lightness in her movement, a sense that the stress and embarrassment she had felt moments ago had been replaced by calm and gratitude. The morning sun reflected softly off the pavement, and a gentle breeze carried the subtle smells of nearby bakeries and coffee shops. It was ordinary, yet her mind felt different, uplifted by the unexpected kindness she had received. As she walked, she replayed the scene in her mind. At first, she had felt nervous and small, counting her coins one by one, trying to get the exact amount. She had worried that people around her were judging her. Every sigh from the young employee had felt like a sharp reminder that she was taking too long, that her actions were inconvenient to others. But then the quiet, calm presence of the man who had stepped in had shifted everything. She remembered how gently he had offered to cover the remaining coins, not in a dramatic or attention-seeking way, but with quiet respect. There was no judgment, no condescension, only understanding. In that moment she felt seen, truly seen, and her dignity restored. She realized that kindness sometimes arrives in the smallest gestures, in silence as much as in words, and that it doesn't need to be flashy or loud to matter. Back in the store, the young employee had returned to his work, but he was changed. The experience had left a mark on him. For the first time that morning, he felt aware of how his impatience and frustration had affected someone else. He thought about the elderly woman's polite demeanor, her nervousness, and her effort to be respectful despite the pressure. He realized how unnecessary his words had been, how easily they could have caused more hurt. He began to act differently. He spoke more softly to other customers, paid closer attention to their needs, and moved through his work with a sense of mindfulness he hadn't had before. It was subtle but noticeable. The other shoppers, those who had witnessed the exchange, could feel the change too. The tension in the store had been replaced by a calm awareness, a sense that small acts of consideration matter more than speed or impatience. Outside, the elderly woman continued her walk. She passed familiar shops and waved politely to neighbors who greeted her. The groceries she carried felt heavier in weight, yet lighter in spirit. She felt grateful not only for the help she had received, but for the reminder that people still cared about one another, that humanity could still shine in everyday moments. As she reached her home, she paused for a moment at the doorway. She set down the bags and took a deep breath. The encounter in the store had left her feeling both relieved and touched. She realized how easily life's little challenges could feel overwhelming, how quickly impatience or rudeness could sour an ordinary morning. And she felt a renewed sense of hope, knowing that even a small act of kindness could turn discomfort into calm, embarrassment into dignity, and isolation into support. Meanwhile, the man who had quietly intervened stepped out of the store. He didn't linger to watch or seek acknowledgement. He walked down the street with a calm, measured pace, blending naturally into the flow of daily life. People passed him without recognizing him. Yet the impact of his action lingered in the store and in the hearts of those who had witnessed it. It was in moments like this that he believed true kindness existed, not as a spectacle, not as a way to gain recognition, but as a simple choice to help another human being. He had seen the nervousness in the elderly woman's hands, the tremble in her voice, and the subtle tension in the store. He had acted quietly and gently, and in doing so, restored a sense of respect and dignity. That, to him, was the real reward. Inside the store, life slowly returned to normal. Customers came and went, picking up groceries and moving through the aisles, some unaware of the earlier tension. Yet the memory of the small act of kindness lingered in the minds of a few who had seen it. The young employee continued with his work, more thoughtful than before. He moved with a quiet awareness, understanding that every small interaction mattered. He realized that kindness and patience were not just ideals, they were choices, ones that could change a person's day, their confidence, and even their view of the world. For the elderly woman, the rest of the day unfolded with a sense of calm and gratitude. She unpacked her groceries carefully, placing each item in its place, feeling a warmth in her heart. She thought about the quiet intervention of the man behind her in the store. She didn't know who he was, and she didn't need to. The act itself had been enough to restore her sense of dignity. She felt hopeful that the world could still surprise people with moments of unexpected care, that human kindness could appear in the smallest, simplest ways. The elderly woman's family, if they had noticed her calm mood, would have seen a subtle difference in her demeanor. She smiled more easily, moved with a lighter step, and spoke with a soft warmth that seemed brighter than before. Sometimes it only takes one small act to shift an entire day, to remind someone of their worth and the goodness still present in the world. Back at the store, the employees and customers slowly adjusted to the ordinary flow of life. The incident had passed, but the memory of it remained. It was a lesson in patience, respect, and quiet empathy, the kind that doesn't need to be broadcast or dramatized. The young employee, now reflecting on his actions, understood that these lessons were far more valuable than efficiency or speed. They were human lessons, the kind that shape character and influence how one treats others. The man who had helped the elderly woman disappeared quietly into the day. He didn't seek acknowledgement, didn't expect thanks, and didn't linger for applause. The act itself was enough. He had intervened in a moment of injustice, helped someone in need, and reminded a few others that simple, thoughtful actions matter. That was all he needed. The elderly woman, resting at home, reflected on what had happened. She thought about how easily the situation could have turned ugly, how small impatience could feel like a heavy weight on someone's shoulders. She realized that kindness, when it appears, can lift that weight instantly. It can transform embarrassment into calm, anxiety into comfort, and helplessness into reassurance. She felt thankful for the gentle, thoughtful presence of the man who had helped her without asking for anything in return, the young employee. Meanwhile, carried the memory with him through the rest of the day. Every time a customer approached, he remembered the elderly woman, the coins, and the small, human act of patience and kindness that had reminded him of what really mattered. His work continued, but with more care, more awareness, and a subtle shift in his approach. It was a quiet change, almost invisible, yet meaningful and real. Sometimes, life offers these small moments, moments that are easy to overlook but carry enormous significance. A simple act of respect, a gentle gesture of help, a quiet intervention in someone's moment of struggle. These things don't require grand effort or public recognition, but their impact can ripple out far beyond the immediate moment. The elderly woman thought about this as she went about her day. She realized that small acts of kindness are often the ones that leave the deepest impressions. They remind us of what is important, what is valuable, and what is truly human. Respect, patience, empathy, these are the qualities that define our best selves. And in that ordinary store on an ordinary morning, those qualities had been shown in the most beautiful way. The day moved on. The store reopened to other customers. The young employee continued his duties with newfound awareness, and life in the neighborhood flowed as usual. Yet the morning's events had created a quiet shift, a subtle but lasting reminder of the power of kindness. Those who had witnessed it, including the elderly woman and the other customers, carried the lesson with them. For the man who had helped, the day continued quietly. He didn't need recognition or thanks. The satisfaction of doing the right thing, of helping without expectation, was enough. He knew that true impact doesn't come from loud gestures, but from thoughtful, human-centered actions that restore dignity and respect. That was the real reward, and it was a reward he didn't need to announce. As the elderly woman finished her day, she reflected on the simple truth that kindness has the power to transform ordinary moments into extraordinary ones. She understood that patience, respect, and empathy aren't just ideals, they are actions that shape the world quietly, one interaction at a time. She felt grateful, not just for the coins that had been covered or the groceries that had been purchased, but for the human connection, the gentle support, and the reminder that even in a hurried, imperfect world, moments of care and dignity are always possible. The young employee, in his quiet reflection, realized that life often tests patience, empathy, and awareness in small, subtle ways. How he responded to them mattered, not just to himself, but to others. The incident had reminded him that treating people with kindness, regardless of circumstances, is a choice, a simple, human choice that can change everything. And so, the ordinary morning in a small store became something more than it seemed. It became a reminder that respect, patience, and quiet acts of kindness can make a lasting difference, that human dignity is worth preserving, that even the smallest gestures can leave a powerful impact on those who witness them. The elderly,